I'd like to welcome everybody to the Dr. Class Tuesday webinar. We have a very special webinar today with Eduardo Moncada, who I will introduce in a moment, talking about an issue of transcendental importance in the hemisphere. But before I get into the affairs of the day, I would be remiss if I did not introduce my co-chair of this seminar series and our director at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, and my friend, Steve Levitsky.
Hi, everybody.
So today's session, we will hear, we have different formats in our Tuesday seminar, as everyone knows, and we like to feature in the seminar series when an important book comes out. We really like to feature that book, and today's session is one of those days. Today we have Eduardo Moncada is the author of the very recently published book from Cambridge University Press, Resisting Extortion, Victims, Criminals, and States in Latin America. And because this topic is so important, we asked him to come and he kindly agreed. Eduardo is the assistant professor of political science at Barnard College in New York City, of course, part of Columbia University. And he is one of our experts on the political economy of crime and violence, as well as urban politics in Latin America. His first book, published from Stanford University Press in 2016, was Cities, Business, and the Politics of Urban Violence in Latin America. He's also co-edited Inside Countries, Subnational Research and Comparative Politics, which came out from Cambridge in 2019. And as I just said, Resisting Extortion, Victims, Criminals, and States in Latin America came out from Cambridge last year. So he is one of our prolific young scholars, and we are just delighted to have him at the Tuesday webinar today. And because it is a book, we also have a tradition where we like to invite discussants to speak and to comment and to kick off our questioning. Today we've invited to do that and to play that role Manuel Melendez Sanchez, who is a graduate student, a PhD candidate in the Department of Government here at Harvard. And Manuel is originally from El Salvador. And he also happens to study criminal violence in Latin America. He is one of our resident experts here among our graduate students, not the faculty, but among our graduate students. And so we pressed Manuel into service. He, of course, immediately accepted. And so I'm looking forward to a great discussion. This discussion will be available for everyone who is attending, everyone who's registered, through Dr. Class's YouTube channel. The video will be available in about a week. And you can also find links in the chat today to our events, to our seminars, to our social media channels. For those of you who would like to hear today's session in Spanish, you can press the interpretation button on your Zoom function. We, of course, want to hear your questions. This will be a discussion, but you can't ask them directly. What we ask you to do is to put them in the question and answer function of Zoom, and you can put them in at any time during the seminar. You don't need to wait until the end to put them in. In fact, we encourage you to put them in along the way so that we have a chance to read them over. What we will do is Steve and I will take turns posing those questions to Eduardo. We'll collect a group of questions and we will pose those questions to him. So first, without further ado then, I would like to turn this over to Eduardo. And Eduardo, we are very happy you're here and we're really looking forward to hearing about your new book. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. And hopefully, let's see if this works. Hopefully you can see my slides. Wonderful. Okay. Well, so good afternoon. It's a pleasure and honor to participate in the Tuesday seminar series. I want to thank Professor Hagopian, Professor Holland, Professor Levitsky for the invitation. I want to thank Manuel Melendez for serving as discussant, and also Paulo Ibarra for coordinating all the logistics behind the scenes here. I'll just jump into things here. Latin America today is a region with a very high level of criminal violence, including lethal violence, as illustrated by the figure on the screen. Today, the region has just 8% of the world's population, but generates 1/3 of the world's homicides each year. And in several parts of the region, this violence is related to the presence and activities of powerful criminal organizations involved in illicit economies. And in recent years, there's been a growing research to understand this lethal violence perpetrated by organized crime. In my book, I try to build on this important research by broadening the analytic lens beyond the emphasis on lethal violence to include another type of crime, extortion. By extortion, I mean the use and/or threat of violence to extract rents in return for the promise of protection. There's a growing recognition that extortion by criminal groups is widespread throughout much of Latin America, but we've largely overlooked this type of kind of pervasive everyday criminality in our research. But a focus on extortion isn't important only empirically, but analytically as well. Much existing theory about violence in the region emphasizes the relations between states and criminal actors, leaving victims as bystanders in our frameworks. But centering victims in our analyses through a focus on criminal extortion can contribute to our understanding of the factors that shape violence, as well as broader patterns of order and disorder, and formal and informal practices of governance in localities where states, criminals, and victims interact. And in the book, I try to show this by analyzing how victims resist criminal victimization, specifically extortion, at the hands of organized crime. So through field work in different localities across Latin America, I identified and analyzed different strategies of resistance to criminal extortion. In Medellin, Colombia, I studied informal vendors in an informal market in the city center who were actively extorted by a criminal gang and who engaged in everyday resistance, meaning individual level practices, discourses, and other nonviolent behaviors that victims use to contest the terms of their victimization without necessarily ending it. In parts of El Salvador, I studied piecemeal vigilantism. A few small-scale farmers extorted by gangs would occasionally come together to work with handfuls of individual police to jointly carry out extra-legal violence against individual members of criminal gangs. In Michoacan, in southwestern Mexico, I studied collective vigilantism, meaning sustained, highly organized collective use and threat of violence against criminals. In this case, the victims that engaged in vigilantism were avocado and berry farmers. And I also found that strategies of resistance can change over time. Those same avocado and berry farmers in Michoacan would have ultimately come to work closely with elected officials and police to prevent extortion through the co-production of local order in ways that simultaneously strengthen and undermine the rule of law. Across these cases, I focus on extortion of different types of business firms, given that both formal and informal businesses are important targets for extortion in the region, and that extortion has serious consequences for economic development. But we see important variation in the ways that victims resist victimization. And this sort of led me to the overarching question for this book. Why do victims use different strategies of resistance in response to similar forms of victimization? And so today, I'm really appreciative of the space I have and the time I have to present some of the work from my recent book in which I tackle this overarching question. I want to start off conceptually here, just to be clear. I define resistance as strategies outside of the rule of law that victims direct at criminal actors to negotiate and or prevent their victimization. And while strategies of resistance differ, at their core, they all share a common feature. They're about challenging criminal authority. Through resistance, victims confront and push against the informal authority that criminal actors exert when they control territory, which is dangerous in a context where criminal actors violently punish people who question their informal authority. This type of behavior by victims is also difficult to study given this context. To study this, I conducted research in localities where extortion takes place in 3 countries, in El Salvador, in Colombia, and in Mexico. The cases here are dyadic relationships between victims and criminals in these specific places. In the book, I analyzed 1 case in Medellin, in Colombia, 2 cases in El Salvador on either end of the country, and 2 cases in Michoacan, in Mexico. Carried out about 13 months of field work spread across several years, where I worked with research assistants to conduct interviews with victims, politicians, police, and civil society members, focus groups with victims, and participatory drawing exercises with them as well, which I'll show a little bit later. I also analyzed judicial files and other government archives related to specific cases. And I structured the project to compare processes of resistance across different field sites in order to trace comparable processes and mechanisms. And I should note 2 scope conditions here for my project. First, the analysis focuses on instances where criminal victimization is an iterative process. In other words, these are repeated and sustained interactions between the criminal actor and the victim. And additionally, these are contexts where the state cannot or will not uphold the rule of law. We would expect distinct processes in places where the state has the capacity to actually uphold the rule of law and offer mechanisms for citizens and victims to be able to use for some form of justice. Now, in the book, I develop an argument that focuses on the interaction between three variables. The first is the time horizons of criminal actors, which is shaped by whether criminals face a threat to their territorial control from the state or criminal rivals. Where criminals face no threat, they have a long time horizon. Their grip on local territory is intact, their networks of local informants are operating at full strength, and they can target their coercive capacity on those who challenge them without the worry of diverting resources from efforts to defend themselves from the state or rivals. Here, criminal actors may even provide victims with goods and services, including protection from everyday crime. So where criminal actors enjoy long time horizons, victims will prefer to negotiate the terms of their victimization instead of trying to challenge a criminal actor that's operating from a position of strength. But when criminal actors' time horizons shorten, criminal actors become more predatory in their interactions with local populations. For victims, this means that they face reduced or no benefits from the criminal actor, meaning that under short time horizons, enduring the status quo becomes much more costly. This prompts a shift in preferences from negotiation to wanting to end victimization. We have to also consider whether victims have the capacity to do so and how. And to assess that, I turn to the nature of the local political economies. Political economies consist of ties among business actors and between them and political authorities, and they can vary subnationally. Some political economies are encompassing. They have a strong central organizational structure that brings both business actors and governing authorities together to collaborate. Other political economies are segmented. They lack a single strong central organizational structure, and that gets reflected in divisions among business actors, weak ties between them and governing authorities. And still other political economies are atomized. Individual businesses largely operate independently from each other, from the state itself. The nature of these political economies impacts the ability of victims to engage in different forms of collective action. Encompassing political economies provide victims with some pre-existing central structure that they can use to mobilize collective resistance as a relatively unified force, coordinating with government authorities. By contrast, segmented economies lead victims to form multiple groups that can end up competing with each other, prove more vulnerable to co-optation by elements of the state or even other criminal actors. And atomized economies provide the weakest foundation for collective action, given a lack of ties among victims and between them and political authorities. So variation in this nature of the local political economy influences the capacity of victims to mobilize collectively to resist victimization and how they do so. And third, I argue that whether police are captured by criminal actors influences the availability of the police as a resource for victims in mobilizing resistance. Where police are captured by criminals, the police are a threat to victims' resistance, and victims have to avoid them in mobilization. By contrast, where police are autonomous, victims can incorporate them into the resistance. And here, police will have incentives to join with victims, particularly if they're trying to remain autonomous from criminal actors, while also being tasked with carrying out crackdowns on those actors by the state. And because these are settings where with low police capacity, police may take part in resistance not by adhering to the rule of law, but instead by helping victims carry out extra-legal practices against criminal actors. The intersection between these three variables leads to distinct strategies of resistance to criminal victimization. And these strategies vary in their structure, in their practices, and their trajectories. Now, I don't have time today to discuss all of the empirical cases in the book, but I do want to talk quickly about a few of the cases to illustrate some of the utility of different parts of the argument. So I'll focus first on a case of everyday resistance, which I argue we should expect to see under one of two scenarios. First, where victims face a criminal actor with a long time horizon. And indeed, across these different localities in Colombia, Mexico, and El Salvador, I found evidence that early under criminal extortion, victims pursued everyday resistance, regardless of their collective capacities or the status of the local police, when that criminal actor extorting them had a long time horizon. The second scenario when we should see everyday resistance, according to the argument, is when victims face a criminal actor with a short time horizon, but lack the capacity to engage in sustained collective action and face a police that's captured by the criminals that's extorting them. And so to illustrate that, let me turn to the case of relations between victims and criminal actors in Medellin, in Colombia. Here, as I noted before, I studied a group of informal street vendors that worked every day of the week in an open air market in the city center, only a short walk from the city's municipal offices, including the mayor's office. But this market was also controlled by a criminal gang that was aligned with a larger drug trafficking group. The gang extorted the vendors on a regular basis every week with the threat and use of violence to ensure that each vendor paid. Early under extortion, the gang operated under a long time horizon, provided the vendors with protection from crime in a very dangerous part of the city. However, extortion became more predatory as the gang's time horizon shortened. This was the result of a breakdown of an equilibrium among larger drug trafficking organizations in Medellin, which led to violent competition between their affiliated gangs in the city center, who wanted to control the extortion rackets. Now, the vendors lacked the ability to engage in collective resistance because of the atomized nature of their political economy. This atomized political economy was a result of displacement, when years earlier the vendors were forcibly displaced from another market by city authorities as part of a broader urban redevelopment effort. This led to the breakdown of the formal organization that the vendors had once established to organize collectively among themselves and to represent their interests collectively in their interactions with local government officials. In the new market, the vendors also faced a local police that was complicit in their victimization. Police patrolling the open air market were paid by the criminal gang to allow it to extort, but also engage in drug sales and other illicit economies within this market. Here's one vendor's drawing that they did during a focus group in Medellin in 2016. As part of these focus groups with vendors, they were asked to draw what generated security or insecurity for them in their place of work. This drawing is by a vendor I call Paulo, and she described her drawing to her fellow focus group participants and myself in the following way. She said, quote unquote, quote, if I see a thief, a delincuente, and tell the police, the policía, then the police should take him away, se lo deben llevar, to jail, or a CAI, Centro de Atención Inmediata, a small jail cell. But instead, they will go around the corner and make a deal, se arreglan, where the police take off the handcuffs, the esposas, in exchange for some money. And if the thief offers enough money, the police will tell him who reported him, the sapo, a snitch. And they will come to where I am working, trabajando, and they will kill me, me matan. And indeed, over the course of about 5 months of field work in this locality, several individuals, about 3 individuals who had grown very frustrated with being extorted by this criminal gang, had turned to the local police that were being paid by the gang and ended up being killed publicly within the market itself. But even when faced with a predatory criminal actor operating under a short time horizon, an atomized political economy, and police captured by criminals, vendors resisted through everyday resistance. And here, everyday resistance meant entailing resisting material domination by the criminal actor, but also other dimensions of victimization. To contest material domination, meaning the money that the gang would forcibly take from them, the vendors engaged in contentious but non-violent negotiations to reduce the amount of money they would have to pay. What mattered here, according to the vendors, wasn't necessarily that they paid less under criminal extortion, but that they managed to deny the criminal actors the full extent of the material rent that they demanded. Or as one vendor noted, well, you don't give the criminals everything they want, you show them, you make them see that you are not some little dog following them and obeying them when they say sit. Vendors also resisted and contested social domination, practices that the criminal gang used to try and undermine their social status, such as physically and verbally humiliating the vendors in front of each other, reminding the vendors repeatedly that social norms in the broader society depicted them as worthless, disposable parts of society. The vendors used rhetorical strategies that pushed back against social domination. For example, members of the criminal gang would often try to hide drugs, even weapons, in the vendors' merchandise that the gang could then use to sell or defend itself. From the perspective of the vendors, this was further evidence of disrespect by the gang members. And the vendors would use rhetorical strategies to try and make clear that they viewed themselves and the gangs as equals, not as subordinates. As one vendor noted, they screw us by hiding drugs in our merchandise. They begin to sit around, we see them, crack pipes, crack rocks, all mixed in our merchandise. And inside of ourselves, we say, oh God, not again. People using us, disrespecting us because we're disposable. But on the outside, we have to walk carefully and do the dance. So we say, look, boys, the thing is that everyone here, you and me, we're all working, and this is my business. And if I get caught with your product, then it's my business that suffers. Finally, the vendors also resisted political domination, efforts by the gang to convince the vendors that the state, not even the police, would help them. As vendors noted, during focus groups and interviews, members of the gang would at times taunt them by encouraging the vendors to call the local police when they were being extorted, because they would say, quote unquote, it's more likely that the police work for us than that they work for you. But vendors would contest this strategically. At times, they would purposefully speak in loud terms with their neighboring vendor about how they had rights as citizens of Colombia, how the Constitution gave them these rights to work and be safe from physical harm. They would have these conversations when the gang members were within earshot. And in my interviews with the vendors, they indicated that this was on purpose to remind the criminal gang that the vendors were not without some degree of political voice. Because of their limited capacity for collective action and the capture of the police, the most tangible element of the state, victims could not engage in other more visible strategies intended to end their victimization. But by centering victims in the analysis, we're able to see how victims may use other more subtle strategies that enable them to negotiate some aspect of material domination, certainly not ending it, but also to reclaim some degree of social dignity and political worth in this relationship. Let me turn to cases in Mexico to help illustrate how variation in local political economies can influence resistance, specifically forms of collective vigilantism. In the two municipalities in Michoacan where I conducted research, Tancítaro and a municipality I call La Unión, agricultural firms were the victims of extortion by the same criminal group, the Knights Templar Drug Trafficking Organization, or DTO. In both cases, the agricultural sectors were enclave economies that produced primarily for export to the United States and other foreign markets. In Tancítaro, the economy revolves around avocados, in La Unión, berries. In both cases, victims faced a criminal actor with short time horizons. The Knights Templar faced state crackdowns from federal and state authorities, growing competition from rival DTOs. Under this shortened time horizon, the Knights Templar was increasingly predatory toward the victims of extortion, increased the amount and frequency of money they demanded, but also the forms and levels of violence they used to pressure their victims to pay. Likewise, in both municipalities, local police have been captured by the drug cartel, could not be counted on as a resource. It was common in both locations, for example, during interviews, for people to note that those who failed to pay the extortion tax would get picked up by the municipal police, arrested, put in the back of the police car, and driven to where the criminals operated to face punishment by them. And though in the two cases, victims in the agricultural sectors mobilized collective vigilantism, the structure, the practices, and the trajectories varied considerably across the two cases. In Tancítaro, victims pursued centralized collective vigilantism, whereas early on in a single organization coordinated victims in carrying out practices against the criminal to end extortion. In La Unión, victims pursued a more decentralized form of collective vigilantism, where from the start, multiple groups of victims formed their own independent organizations to carry out violence, not only against the criminal actor, but also against each other as they competed for resources and authority within the municipality. Why, given these similar conditions, do we see this variation in forms of collective vigilante? I trace the variation back to differences in the nature of the local political economies. Tancítaro's avocado sector had an encompassing political economy, featuring strong ties among economic actors and between them and local government. By contrast, La Unión's featured a segmented political economy, weak links among economic actors and between them and local government. In the municipality of Tancítaro, avocado growers had actually been banned from exporting their product to the United States since 1914. That ban became a focal point for mobilization among avocado growers in the late 20th century in the lead up to the signing of what was then called the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. As part of this lobbying, avocado growers in coordination with local government authorities engaged in organization building to represent their interests. The ban was ultimately lifted in 1997, and today we get the majority of our avocados from Michoacan. But the legacy of this mobilization, the institutional legacy, was a single cohesive associational organization in Tancítaro with high member density, encompassed all of the municipality's avocado growers and exporters, a robust internal decision-making structure for debating and formulating and enacting market decisions, the collective pooling of resources through membership fees to sustain the organization. Membership in this organization was compulsory. You had to be a member of the associational organization in order to have your avocados exported to the lucrative US market. By contrast, in La Unión, increased economic integration under NAFTA had the opposite effect. Historically, this was an area that produced sugarcane, but that sector collapsed post-NAFTA when US high fructose corn syrup began flooding the Mexican sugar market. It was at that point that foreign firms, mainly from Chile and the United States, set up export firms in La Unión and engaged in predatory contract farming for berries, mainly blackberries, but also strawberries. Under contract farming, the commercial firms agree to buy products from farmers who themselves rent and own the land they work. But this passes on most of the risks and investment requirements to the producers, forcing them to compete against each other to get individual commercial export firms to buy their product. Berry producers in La Unión tried to organize repeatedly during the 1990s and early 2000s to establish a single sectoral organization to represent their interests, and failed. The result was a segmented political economy where you had multiple berry associations, none of which encompassed a majority of producers, but which instead formed around producers in particular localities that contracted with individual firms. These associations lacked clear internal decision-making structures, didn't offer members selective benefits. They were largely the projects of individual berry producers. And in contrast to Chancitero, the segmentation within the berry sector in La Union limited its political influence to individual, particularistic ties to political authorities, instead of the more institutionalized ties we see in avocado sector in Chancitero. How did this affect collective vigilantism? In Chancitero, victims used the same organization that was used to export avocados to the United States for our consumption here to also organize collective violence against the Knights Templar that had extorted them. A single self-defense group emerges early on among avocado producers and exporters. They use the structure of that sectoral organization to coordinate violence. This single group also coordinates with the local mayor to have them exit the municipality in the days before the armed uprising to protect the mayor from reprisal from the criminal actors. The practices of centralized vigilantism included highly coordinated forms of violence in which victims were dispatched by coordinating authorities from within the organization in the avocado sector. Additionally, victims harnessed the ties among them to pursue informal justice. They would hold informal meetings to settle disputes emerging from the period of time when the Knights Templar had controlled local territory. For example, one of the tactics the Knights Templar began pursuing was to take over people's avocado producing lands by requiring them to sell them to members of the criminal organization. As part of centralized collective vigilantism, victims organized hearings where they would hear from the people who alleged that they had been forced to sign away their lands, and leaders from the associational organization would issue verdicts as to whether they were believed and whether the land should be returned to them. The centralized nature of collective vigilantism under this single organization also enabled them to sustain resistance over time. The trajectory was one of a single unified group early on that was able to rebuff state offers to institutionalize them by making them part of an ineffective rural police force, but also to rebuff rival criminal groups from co-opting them by displaying their collective coercive capacity. Throughout this, the strong ties to local authorities enabled victims to continue mobilizing, even when federal government of Mexico demanded that they disband. Chancitero's mayor, for example, allowed victims to continue operating as a self-defense group within municipal borders, despite the self-defense group being deemed or declared illegal by federal authorities. In La Union, by contrast, the segmented nature of the political economy led to decentralized collective vigilantism. Instead of a single self-defense group, 5 different groups emerge in La Union. The lack of substantive ties to local authorities means that, in contrast to Chancitero, the mayor of La Union actually has to flee the municipality under threat of violence from both victims and the Knights Templar drug trafficking group once victims began pursuing vigilantism. And instead of tightly coordinated violence against their criminal victimizers, each of the 5 self-defense groups engage in different practices of violence against victimizers, but also against each other as they compete to become the main self-defense group in the municipality. Early efforts to have informal justice mechanisms like the one that succeeded in Chancitero early on collapsed a few days into the uprising in La Union. These divisions and the resulting competition among the 5 self-defense groups reflected the vulnerability of decentralized vigilantism to co-optation as well, to the state and to rival criminal groups. Federal government was able to transform some of these 5 self-defense groups into official but largely ineffective rural police forces. Other self-defense groups were co-opted by rival criminal groups who provided victims with support in their uprising against the Knights Templar in exchange for help in then restarting and controlling local drug production and trafficking in the municipality. That absence of ties to local political authorities in La Union meant that the municipal mayor worked cooperatively with federal authorities to try and pressure the local self-defense groups into disbanding or becoming part of the state. At one point, unlike the mayor of Chancitero that shielded the self-defense group from federal authorities, the mayor of La Union actually invited federal troops into the municipality to provide security and disband the self-defense groups. So in both cases, the nature of the pre-existing political economies influenced the particular ways in which victims organized and enacted collective vigilantism. Again, highlighting how even when holding criminal capture of the police constant, even when the general nature of the political economy enables collective action, variation in the way that political economy is structured among members and between them and political authorities can produce very distinct forms of collective vigilantism with different trajectories over time. I know I'm running out of time here, so in terms of some just key takeaways from this part of the research and some broader implications. On the one hand, I think my analysis underscores the need to bring victims more squarely into our studies of the politics of crime and violence. There's rich research on state-criminal relations, but little on the role of victims in these contexts and how they are impacted by criminal violence, but also how they respond to it in ways that have broader implications. Second, and relatedly, it suggests that victims can exercise agency in the context of their victimization. And I do so by developing this argument that I think starts to help us understand resistance through a focus on time horizons, local political economies, and criminal capture of the police. In terms of broader implications, I think there's a need for more dialogue between studies of the political economy of development and crime, violence, and illicit markets. The two are often operating separately despite interaction between the two. And second, I draw in my research on work from civil wars, which highlights ways that the two agendas on on non-state governance and civil wars, but also in context of organized crime, might be able to speak to each other. And a third takeaway, finally, is the need to think about variation in state responses to resistance as well, particularly collective vigilantism, the most visible manifestation of citizens trying to fill in for the state. So here I propose that one next step in this research agenda is to consider state responses to collective vigilantism in a comparative perspective as well. Thank you again for the time, and sorry for going a little bit over, but I look forward to the discussion and the questions.
Not at all. You were perfectly disciplined. You were perfectly on time, and we were enjoying it. I wasn't even paying attention to the time because I was enjoying it so much. And I now want to call on our discussant, Manuel Melendez, who I mentioned was from El Salvador, but didn't mention has become quite the commentator on El Salvador and has a very widely circulated and talked about article in the Journal of Democracy published last year called Millennial what? Help me out here.
Authoritarianism.
Millennial authoritarianism. Okay. And he knows everything about Salvadoran politics. He knows everything about criminal politics in the hemisphere. And so we thought he'd be the perfect discussant. So Manuel, let me hand it over to you. See if you can be as good on time as Eduardo.
Sure. Thanks, Fran. Let me just say first, Eduardo, I think you've written an amazing book. I am about 2/3 of the way through it, and I can't get enough. I think the focus on victims' agency and what victims do across the region in the face of criminal threats is incredibly compelling, sort of both theoretically, but also normatively. So thank you for bringing our attention to this. It's so richly researched. I will confess that I'm one of those people who tends to skim empirical sections. I am not skimming your empirical sections, and it's just so well written. So if anyone's listening, go pick up the book. Go take a look. It's fantastic. It is very rich, and there is so much to unpack here. And I don't want to take up too much time. So let me just very quickly put out there sort of 4 groups of questions, and then a lot of you can choose sort of what to address and then what not to address. So the first is almost a prior question to this theoretical framework you're laying out, which is how common is resistance to extortion, and what can you tell us about when it happens? The reason I think this is important is that I think it can help us understand how much you're explaining here. Precisely for some of the reasons you explained, this stuff is really hard to observe and hard to study. I actually don't have a good sense of how frequently communities stand up to extortion, whether it's everyday resistance or something more dramatic. So what is your sense of how common this is? And if you have any kind of insights on when it happens in the first place, that might be really interesting to hear about. So that's number 1. Number 2, I had some questions about time horizons. And sort of both on the criminal organization side, and I think more interestingly on the victim side. So on the criminal organization side, I wonder how you think about untangling time horizons per se, and especially changing time horizons per se, versus the things that change time horizons in the first place. So for example, if we see increased criminal competition in some city in Colombia, how do we untangle the effects of the criminal organization's time horizons are shortening versus, oh, there is now more criminal competition, so some of these incentives have changed and some of this context has changed. That's sort of a question I was trying to wrap my head around, and I'm just wondering if you can help me think about that a little bit more clearly. On the victim side, your description sort of got me thinking that it really seems like victims' time horizons must be really important here as well. And obviously your focus is on the time horizons of criminal organizations, and that makes a lot of sense. But it seems to me like victims' time horizons probably influence their kind of their sort of investment approach, so to speak, and how they're thinking about maybe even building some of these resistance institutions in places where there is a low prior ability for collective action. And, I'm thinking about situations like comparing extortion of businesses versus residential extortion, right? If you own a small stand in a mercado somewhere, you have a lot more mobility than if you're being extorted in the place where you live, or even worse, if your tiendita is just down the street from where you live. And I feel like those are two very different situations from the perspective of time horizon. So just wondering if you sort of thought about how this might play into your argument. All right, very quickly, really don't want to take too long. I want to invite you to give us a quick description of some of the outcomes in your story that you did not talk about. As you might suspect, I am especially interested in piecemeal vigilantism. I would be neglecting my patriotic duty if I didn't ask you to say a word or two about El Salvador and how that case differs from the others. I'm also fascinated by co-production of order. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it sort of seems like out of these 5 boxes you present to us, co-production of order is sort of where we want to be. If we're going to end up in one of these 5 boxes, and if we're going to have extortion, we probably want to be, that seems like the least worst outcome. It does seem like the road to getting there is very thin and very difficult. So you sort of need all of these things to come together. So if you can maybe just give us one example of a place where order is being co-produced to give us some hope, that'd be great. And then finally, it's really hard to read this without thinking about policy implications. And that's 100% a compliment, because I think that's what the best political science does. It gets you thinking about policy implications. And again, just wanted to invite you to share sort of any intuitions or hunches you have about what the policy implications are of this story. One thing that caught my attention is and what I'm looking at off screen is that tree that you showed in one of your slides with how you produce the different outcomes. And I was looking at that, and one thing that struck me was that if we're in this world where criminal organizations have short time horizons, the level of collective action enabled by the local political economy is low, then a policy that might seem as controversial as, for example, strengthening the police force can have these complicated unintended consequences. It could sort of shift us from a world where people are engaging in everyday resistance to a world where you have piecemeal vigilantism. And in the short term, at least, that could lead to more violence, and that could lead to sort of an escalation in criminal conflict. So those are my random musings on the policy implications. I'm sure you thought about this much more than I have, and I'd love to hear any thoughts. But that's it. Again, thanks for this book. It's fantastic, and everyone should go take a look.
So Eduardo, this is our trick here, is that we limit your time to an impossibly short time when you present your book, but then we give you time to answer these great questions from our graduate students. And so you should really feel free to take some time to answer these questions. I just want to elaborate, because we have a couple of questions from the audience about one of the issues that Manuel raised, and that was time horizons, his second issue. So Fernando Bizarro asks 2 questions about time horizons. He first asked why gangs have long time horizons early on. Why, if a gang is young and not well established, how could it possibly have a long time horizon? So like, what is going on with the gang time horizons? And then I swear he wrote this before Manuel said, just before Manuel said, and what about the victims' time horizons? So he was also asking, so like thinking along in parallel with Manuel, he was also asking how victims' reaction shaped the time horizons of gangs. And how do we think about making your theory dynamic, being when there's probably some interplay going on between the time horizons of the victims and the gangs? And with that, I will mute myself here and let you now talk about the Salvadoran case, the policy implications, the frequency, and all the other wonderful questions that Manuel has put.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Manuel. Those were just great, sharp questions. I really appreciate them, and they're provocative for the discussion. So I do appreciate them. Let me try and tackle some of them and see where we can take the conversation. So Maybe I'll just start with what the very first one, which is kind of the broadest one in a sense, in terms of what's the universe here of cases, right? And I think, I mean, on the one hand, we don't know the universe of cases because we haven't studied this empirically very much. And one of the things I note in the book is that one of the things that would be helpful empirically for us is to start also studying failed cases of resistance, right? So there are across these three localities of Colombia, El Salvador, and Mexico, I came across multiple instances where individuals that I was interviewing would note how they had tried to do these things previously, right? Different forms of resistance, different forms of mobilization that weren't captured in local media, that didn't make international CNN media, like when the autodefensas emerged in Mexico, or didn't capture the attention of the United Nations as some of the piecemeal vigilantism has done in parts of El Salvador in recent years. But these are still happening, right? And they're still occurring. And so there are opportunities for us to, on the one hand, build our units, our observations, or the size of our N, but also then think about this variation a bit more and be able to theorize a bit more. So, you know, I don't have the most satisfying answer in terms of saying, well, you know, this is an X proportion of what's happening in the field. But I do think it is a phenomena that exists empirically, that we haven't studied enough, and that we need to sort of be able to map out a bit more. That raises methodological challenges as well, right? Not in terms of how one does that. For example, in this particular study, I did one approach, which was to really do a lot of field work on the ground in these different localities and really get granular with a lot of the data collection and process tracing. We can think of other methodologies. For example, right now I'm working on forms of collective vigilantism in Mexico City, where I'm using media archives, right, which gives us one cut at it. But I think we also need to use other tools to cut at it too, in order to reduce biases, like surveys of communities at the neighborhood level. We're scraping Twitter data as well to also identify instances or practices of collective vigilantism. So I think you know, it's one of those topics that's going to really require those multi-method approaches to be able to try and triangulate and get at the big picture here to some degree. In terms of time horizons, right? So time horizons, the big topic, which was a great question, but you had kind of 2 points to it, and Fernando Bizarro also had kind of 2 points to it as well. So let me try and tackle those. And so on the first one, Manuel, you posed the question of how do we kind of disentangle time horizons and what's happening, what's causing the time horizon shift, right? To some degree, I think that's how I kind of interpreted it. And I think that's it's a tricky question, not a tricky question, but a tricky subject, right? Because how do you kind of, in this dynamic setting, pinpoint the catalyst, the most proximate catalyst for a shift in the time horizons of the criminal actors? So I try to do it in two ways, empirically, in terms of how to analyze it, right? One is through kind of a historical process tracing in each of these cases, right? So in each of these cases, in the book, in the chapters, I go back several decades in each locality to try and identify, well, what's the status of sort of state criminal relations and relations among criminal actors in these localities way before I get to my cases, right, the temporally. So if I can try and kind of process trace that a bit, I'm able to get some leverage, right, to kind of think about, well, these dynamics or these time horizons weren't static, but they were actually fluctuating if we can cast these in a bit of a historical lens. So I try to do some of that in the book, and I try to do it also as well through some interviews that I was able to garner with members of these criminal groups as well in places in El Salvador, in Colombia, and in Mexico, to kind of not necessarily ask them, well, what was your time horizon, but ask them questions that would help me sort of discern, to what degree did you feel like pressure from the state, pressure from criminal actors were changing some of the tactics, some of the strategies, some of the objectives that you had about this territory and the population and how you acted toward it. I think those are, two ways to kind of start to untangle it. But I think you're right insofar as, and Francis mentioned this as well, right, that at some point these, especially in the midst of these types of mobilizations, these things start to interact with each other, right? They start to kind of feed off of each other as well. So to the degree that we can kind of separate them temporally early on, I think that helps a little bit analytically, right, to get some analytical purchase on it. But then the related question that both you and Fernando had about then victims' time horizons is a really great one. I mean, So this book, was an effort to kind of think about variation in civilian mobilization, civilian resistance to criminal extortion. I think the next sort of step in this is to then think about as well, right, and talking about sort of other cases where this type of civilian mobilization fails, right? In each of my cases, we see efforts that largely succeed to some degree, right? In Mexico, certainly, in Colombia, on the terms of everyday resistance. Piecemeal vigilantism is a bit more messy, but I'll get to that in El Salvadoran case. But we might imagine that we could have better analytical purchase on how victims' time horizons and their actions impact the time horizons of gangs, which is the question that I see from Fernando in the chat. We might get better analytical purchase there by also comparing cases where this type of mobilization fails, right, where it collapses, where it's unable to actually pressure the criminal actor out of its territory, and maybe have a different effect on their sort of perception of their control over the local territory. One related point on this, and again, you guys should stop me if I start going over my time here. But one related point on this that I thought of when you were speaking, Manuel, was about the sort of sunk costs of the victims, right? You were saying like, well, are we thinking about the same things here when we're talking about sort of agricultural workers versus vendors? Well, I mean, part of the comparison in the book is thinking about vendors and to some degree, even these like small scale farmers as individuals have a lot less vested in the territory in which they're operating, right? In El Salvador and in Medellin. El Salvador being a place where these localities have tons of outmigration. People are willing to make that shift and abandon essentially their livelihoods and homes and lands in the face of criminal extortion. Vendors in Medellin having that mobility to shift to a market as well. But even there, we still see variation in these forms of resistance, right? So I think there's something there in terms of the almost comparable levels of sunk costs, especially then when you look at agricultural sectors in Mexico, large-scale enclave economies that are deeply rooted in the territory, but still have variation in their forms of resistance as well, tracing it back to the political economy. Let's see, the El Salvadoran case, right? So I don't want you to get on the wrong foot with El Salvador. So I definitely want to address that. So in the El Salvadoran case, which was, I would say, in some ways, even the most difficult case to kind of do for this project for a variety of reasons that I'm happy to talk about and have a conversation about. In that case, I analyzed how criminal gangs, particularly the MS-13 in the localities, the MS-13 gang in the localities where I conducted research, operating on this short time horizon, was extorting small-scale farmers, mainly basic grain farmers. These are farmers that, while El Salvador historically had relied on the agricultural sector for its production, for its revenue generation, post-1992, post the Civil War, you see this shift in the political economy of El Salvador, a shift toward industry, services, and finance, and really the abandonment of much of the agricultural sector, particularly small grain farmers, who become sort of disorganized. They find their state subsidies eroding and are forced to really compete against each other to be able to survive to some degree through production of crops for sale to markets in the domestic market, but also for their consumption in their own households. So you have communities that have a very limited capacity to engage in collective action. But what's unique about the El Salvadoran case is in this broader context of a very sharp state crackdown on gangs, you have a police that is in part willing to participate in many of these extrajudicial actions. There are already cases that have been documented in El Salvador of death squads operating within the police themselves, undertaking extrajudicial violence against gang members as part of this broader kind of populist punitiveness in the country. What's, I think, a bit different in my analysis is that through this historical process tracing, I identify how victims initiate this piecemeal vigilantism, but strategically invite elements of the police in, right? Because inviting the police in gives you access to tools and resources, everything from basic things like police uniforms that you can use as a farmer to operate freely in a municipality and break into a gang member's or alleged gang member's home and assassinate them, to information on other police patrols that are operating in the area that may not be aligned with you, that might catch you and arrest you. I remember one particular farmer through a wiretap of his phone, who was one of the leaders of one of these groups in a community in El Salvador, reassuring another farmer that they wouldn't get caught by saying, it's okay, we have essentially the law in our hands, right? Meaning we have these police officers that are giving us these resources, and that gives us the law, control over the law to some degree. So I think it's also an interesting variant of not assuming in the El Salvadorian case, which can be tempting, I think, to think this is all state-run violence or state-led violence, but instead it has to be a bit more dynamic and bringing victims into the analysis that way. I wonder if we should pause and maybe take some more questions, and then I can try and address the other questions, the great questions that Manuel had as well.
Did you want to elaborate a little more on co-produce?
Oh, sure, yeah, yes.
Sorry, I'm not going to get the term right, but I think that was
co-production, yes, absolutely. So this was a great question about, is this where we want to be, particularly in that kind of tree diagram, right? And I get this question a lot. I get the point raised, well, is this kind of, by arguing that victims have agency and engaging in these actions, are we normatively saying that things like vigilantism or co-production are good things, right, that we would want as outcomes? And I think you put an interesting preface on it, Manuel, when you said, well, if we have to have extortion, right, if we have to have a context where criminal actors are engaging in extortion, is this the least worst outcome to some degree? I think that's, it depends on the metrics to some degree that we're talking about. If we put on our political science hat and think about the metrics, are we talking about, we're talking about a scenario under co-production where the state and local order is essentially reliant on this tacit coordination between legal and illegal actors, between victims that have taken the law into their own hands and elements of the formal police and elected officials, coordinating with each other to allow for a form of order to take place under this co-production, but one that violates the basic tenets of the rule of law, right? By allowing victims to still carry military-grade weapons, by allowing victims to trump local police in who gets arrested and dictating who gets to pass through certain roads or not through other roads, by holding their own informal justice mechanisms. How long can those two things coexist before democratic institutions give way and governance sort of collapses, or formal governance kind of collapses in that kind of a context? So I guess I don't have much of a satisfying answer, but I wouldn't say that's where we want to be. But it certainly, I think, is a scenario that raises long-term institutional implications for how order, governance, and democracy function in these localities, and very worrisome implications for them. So I wouldn't want my work to sort of suggest, or to be interpreted as an endorsement, I guess, of co-production as the way to move forward, because I don't think that's the way to move forward in these types of contexts.
Okay, great. So I think I just want to insert myself and ask question about just some clarifications before I turn this over to Steve to ask a round of questions from our audience. I'm having a little bit of what you've presented has been so rich. I'm just trying to wrap my head around all the interactions that are going on here. And at times the police might side with the community, and at times the police might side with the criminal organizations. Paulo in Colombia, the vendor, drew a stark diagram of the police cooperating with the criminal organization. Yet in Michoacan, or at least in one of the Michoacan municipalities, they'll go along with the community if the community is well organized. So it's a little bit hard for me to gauge what we're defining as success and failure of resistance. At times I thought that the failure and success was whether they could hang together, whether they could recover some dignity, whether they could recover some self-respect. But I wasn't sure if they were actually modifying the behavior of the, at one extreme, it would be kicking the criminal organizations out of their territory. At the other extreme, it would simply be, okay, I can't get rid of you, but you're going to treat me like I'm a professional. You're going to treat me, you're just not going to leave your junk with me, or you're going to address me with respect, or, at least trying to not quite so much feel like victims. So I guess I'm trying to understand the range of outcomes and exactly what impact resistance, I mean, Scott's famous everyday forms of resistance was actually showing the ways in which peasants could sabotage the efforts of the landlords. They couldn't overthrow them. They couldn't, it wasn't a peasant revolution like in Vietnam or in China, but they could slow up, they could gum up the works. I don't have a great sense of where people can gum up the work. I mean, I get a great sense of where resistance is more likely. But I'm not having a great sense of, maybe that's beyond the capacity of local people to resist. I don't know. But if you could help clarify which actors are actually, who are the first movers here, or, you know, it would just help me to sort of put this picture in perspective before we get back to some very specific questions from the audience. And
Yeah, great. Thank you. Absolutely, thank you. So I think, you know, on the question of sort of what is success here, I think it's, I mean, on the one hand, we might say, well, success is ending criminal extortion, but on the other hand, because the capacity to be able to engage in behaviors that would end extortion vary across these cases, the victims themselves sort of gauge their successes in different ways, right? So if you're a vendor in Medellin and you're unable to mount some sort of you know, your version of a peasant revolution against the local gang to be able to throw them off and get extortion ended, perhaps all that success means for you are these kind of almost intangible indicators of being able to push back against the criminal gang, being able to say, well, not today, I'm not going to be able to give you any money today, or I'm going to have to give you less this week, or being able to reclaim some of that dignity and social respect. It doesn't end victimization and it doesn't end extortion, certainly by any means, but I think by flipping the analysis to think about how victims understand this process and how they define some of these elements in their relationships with criminal actors, it pushes us to think less about what ends criminal extortion, but instead think about what are the range of actions that victims can undertake and how do these different actions impact criminal extortion in these places, right? As you noted, right, that's very different from something like collective vigilantism, where you're essentially running out a criminal actor and displacing them from that locality and stopping their capacity to engage in extortion in that sense. So I guess I would kind of frame it that way in terms of thinking about that process. And on the, you mentioned on sort of the police as well as one key actor here. I guess I'm not sure if maybe I misspoke when I was presenting, but in the Mexican case, police in both localities were captured by criminal actors, right? So there was criminal capture by the Knights Templar of police in both Transitero and La Union. It didn't vary in those cases. The only case that I have in my analysis, at least, where the police are able to maintain some degree of autonomy is in the El Salvadorian cases that I analyze.
Okay, me toca. Eduardo, I'm going to harvest a few questions from the audience. My brain wasn't big enough to stitch them into a coherent whole, so they're going to be a little disparate, but they're all interesting. One of them coming from June sort of picks up on the question of failed resistance and the range of outcomes related to failed resistance. And she pointed out that as someone who works on a number of asylum cases, that a large number of recent asylum cases in the US have to do with people fleeing extortion. So flight is a pretty significant strategy for a large number of people. So she wanted you to sort of take a look at it, discuss a little bit where that fits in. Another question from Marcos was your discussion of centralized collective vigilantism. I didn't work on my pronunciation this morning. Reminded him of the militias in Rio.
in English.
And in any language. I just didn't get my brain cranking this morning. Militias in Rio, and this is obviously not one of your cases, and it's never fair to say, you know, what about this additional case, but could you speak to the militias in Rio as a case and how that might fit into the framework? I understand it's not an easy question. Very different question from June. She was really fascinated by your drawing technique, wanted to know a little bit more about where that came from, whether how much precedent there is in this sort of research and using that as part of an interview strategy. And finally, a question related to the U.S. the recent U.S. avocado ban, which shows how organized crime can have a stake in pretty large scale legal international business. And I guess the question was basically is what does it mean when a criminal group gets to a point where it is able and willing to try to extort pretty powerful international actors? I mean, is that just an overreach, or what does this mean? I threw a lot at you, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, great series of questions. Thank you, everyone, for posing those. I'll take them in order, I guess, starting with the first question from June about kind of the exit strategy or asylum cases. As someone who does a fair amount of asylum cases as well, from people fleeing from Central America and Mexico and Colombia, I share the observation that extortion is often one of these factors that people identify as the reason for leaving behind their families, friends, and livelihoods and homes. And indeed, to use Steve's framing, right, this could be sort of interpreted or classified as evidence of the exit strategy, right, where individuals are willing to do that. And in somewhat in the book, though in other work, I argue that, you know, we might kind of think about, in a broader picture, thinking about civilian responses to criminal victimization, like extortion. It might be useful to tap into Albert Hirschman's work, right? Thinking about exit, voice, and loyalty, and using that framework to kind of think about exit as sort of out-migration, either within your country of origin or to the United States and other places, as we see in these asylum cases. Voice as a form of resistance, though that can vary in different ways. Loyalty becomes a bit troublesome or a bit thornier to tackle, though I think much work, I try to do a little bit of this in the book, but emerging work on sort of civilian agency in contexts of political violence argues that you can indeed have sort of a form of loyalty by civilians to armed groups, which we might classify as sort of obedience to these armed groups, you know, recognizing that it's an imperfect form of governance, but not taking steps to either amend it or flee it. So I think it's a great point. Marco, I think it was Marcos's point about the militias in Rio. So this is a great question. I think there is a parallel here insofar as, and I haven't studied militias, so I'll put that caveat there in terms of my interpretation. But I think there is an interesting parallel insofar as the initial impetus for militias or the initial mode of operation for militias seem to be this sort of centralized form of collective vigilantism, where they emerge in a highly coordinated fashion, in part from the state, to be able to engage in extra-legal violence, coordinated extra-legal violence against drug gangs. What I think is also instructive from the militia case, and it speaks back to some of the cases here, I didn't get to touch on this in the presentation, and this goes back to Manuel's question about sort of what's the worst least option, is that in all the cases of collective vigilantism, as in the case of militias in Rio, you see them engaging in over time engaging in many of the same criminal activities that they emerged to stop in the first place, right? So drug trafficking, indiscriminate forms of violence against community members, predatory forms of governance, much like you see in Mexico today among several of the self-defense groups that emerged that I studied, that emerged arguing that they were going to bring justice and stop extortion, and end up becoming, over time, several years later, extortionists themselves, involved in the drug trade themselves, almost indistinguishable from the drug cartels that they emerged in the first place to stop. So I think there's something really instructive there about that parallel with the militias. June's question about the drawing technique. So that's a great question. I think the drawing technique was in part an effort to make sure that in the focus group, I wasn't getting biased responses only from the individuals that were most outspoken, which often tended to be the men in the group. So I always had mixed gender groups. And to try and make sure that others who may not have spoken up or felt comfortable speaking up during the conversation of a focus group would perhaps find some comfort in just making a drawing and then sharing it with the group. And indeed, I found that oftentimes individuals that had been relatively quiet during the focus group conversation, which lasted an average of about an hour and a half or so, would take great pride and really enjoy sort of sharing their drawing and communicating to us through that drawing what they perceive to be security and insecurity in their workplace. And there is some precedent for this type of work. So Elizabeth Wood used some of this in her work on El Salvador. an insurgent collective action there. There's been some use of participatory drawing exercises as well by urban geographers that are studying urban violence in Latin America. It's not common, and I just happen to be kind of a bit familiar with some of it and some of the theory behind it. So I thought it would be a good tool to use in this type of context when you're talking about subject matters that are really difficult to work through, and that people may not always be comfortable, very comfortable talking about openly. And yes, I should have noted during the presentation the timeliness of all of this insofar as our avocados were temporarily halted from Michoacan from being exported to the United States, strategically perhaps right before the Super Bowl, as a way to, in part as a response to a threat issued, I don't know if it's been verified, but a threat issued allegedly by a criminal actor against a member of the United States Department of Agriculture who have several personnel working in Michoacan as part of this close coordination of Michoacan up until recently being the only place that would export avocados. So the question that was asked about, well, you know, what is this? How do we kind of interpret this beyond the individual case of what just happened a few weeks ago? I think it does, to some degree. I mean, I certainly had never come across in my conversations and time in Michoacan and my analysis of archives, I had never come across an instance where a criminal organization threatened a member of the U.S. government, essentially, and a U.S. employee working in these localities. That seemed to always be, it seemed to be kind of off, beyond limits, I should say. That said, one of the challenges of these localities, these types of places, is that things are very fluid over time. And Michoacan has become much more complex over time as well, even from the time period when I was doing field work there. You have multiple additional criminal actors contesting territory there. You see innovations and forms of violence that resemble warfare today with the use of drones and other techniques by criminal cartels, indiscriminate killing of civilians through these drones and other techniques. So the situation has become, I think, a lot more fragmented in terms of the criminal landscape. The state has really struggled to assert authority in these localities. And perhaps that's this recent action is kind of a reflection of that, I think analysts that focus specifically on Michoacan, particularly people that are based there, have argued as of late that, you know, the state seems to really have lost its grip on the state of Michoacan, that the government has lost its grip on the state. And this is a locality where perhaps these types of actions, you know, targeting powerful international actors like the US government might not be off limits anymore.
War in Ukraine, dollar avocados. Just as my dietitian is telling me I need to eat more avocados, you know, like what next in the world? So we're not going to let you off the hook too easily. We let you defer sort of temporarily on Manuel's question about policy implications.
Yes.
But this is just too important for us not to talk about. We have all kinds of actors, not just criminal actors, but we've got police. We've got the militias in Brazil are made up of, like, you know, off-duty cops, ex-firefighters. We've got everyone, you know, from these countries, there's a lot of variation in who makes up these self-defense forces. They can be small vendors, or they can be, you know, landowners, are private armies. I mean, and anything in between. So we've got all kinds of, we've got, you know, the military and the police can be separate and acting differently. And people are afraid to go to the police for obvious reasons in many of these communities. I mean, what does your work tell us about how, see, this is one of the most important policy issues in the hemisphere is hemispheric security and the insecurity, the violence that people have to live with every day in these countries. It's just heartbreaking. What can we do about it? What does your work tell us about what, if you were called in by the Biden administration and said, you know, what do we do? What do we press for? What would you say?
No. That's
it's a hard question, but hey, you hear it the Tuesday seminar. What can I say?
Absolutely. I mean, I think in a way, and this kind of reflects or bounces off of Manuel's point where he was talking about the tree diagram, and what happens if, you know, the police get reformed at one particular instance, but other things aren't aligned. What kind of outcomes do we get? Do we get positive outcomes or negative outcomes? I think part of this is things have to, many of these types of changes that we would want to see, at least based off of the argument that I'm developing, have to happen to some degree parallel to each other, right? So police reform can't happen as a project unto itself, even though for the past 20 years or so, and you have a wonderful scholar who's been working on this, Iniela Gonzalez in HKS, even though over the past 20 years, this has been at the top of the priority for USAID and other international organizations working on trying to figure out what do we do with insecurity and violence and crime in Latin America? We reform the police, right? Well, if that happens absent or not in tandem with and in coordination with the building of things like strong core organizations within civil society or business groups, and in the absence of a state policy or a government policy that doesn't try to address both sort of the enforcement arm of things, but also the need to engage in social investment in many of these communities, you can get a recipe for sort of disaster. You can get a recipe for some of the outcomes that I'm talking about here. So, you know, it's not necessarily the most satisfying answer, but I think there has to happen. There have to be parallel forms of investment and reform happening at the same time and in coordination with each other within society and within state institutions. Because if you do one without the other, there is the opportunity for the weaker actor to sort of try and co-opt elements of the other, right? Either co-opt elements of the police or police co-opt civilian resistance to mobilize for their own ends, like we see in militias in Rio. There has to be a tightly coordinated process of institution building within society and within the state itself. And doing that is obviously one of the perennial challenges that comparative politics and broader political science has been trying to figure out for quite some time. How do we do that and do it effectively, given the vested interests that benefit from a lot of this crime and violence, given the vested interest engaged in corruption, given the vested interest engaged in the drug trade. Those are sort of it's just some of the, I think, the key challenges to getting to that space where we might be able to say state and society can work with each other on these issues.
So that's great, thank you. If I can just follow up then. When you were talking about what else has to happen in addition to police reform, and you said strengthening business and civil society, are these things sort of equal? If you have a strong business community, is that the answer? I mean, if you have a lot of really tightly organized vendors, are they able to be as effective as a coordinated business community? Is that where we see the most effective resistance, or is it really just a matter of the community standing together? I mean, I'm just kind of curious of how much of this is really having a strong business, a strong private sector, basically.
Well, having a strong private sector, but again, in tandem with other factors, right? So it's not enough to simply have a strong business organization in a context where police are encouraged to engage in extra legal violence. That's simply a recipe for the business community to co-opt elements of the police for their own private ends. But if you have both at the same time, a democratic police force and a cohesive business community and a cohesive civil society writ large, I think that increases the probability of a more productive form of coordination between the two to deal with these issues and not slipping into the types of kind of extra legal violence and resistance that I outline in the book.
Okay, perfect. Well, then I would like to close now, and we're just on time. And this is a first. I should chair every week, Steve.
You should chair every week.
But before we do close, I want to thank you so much on behalf of our entire Harvard community, Eduardo, for coming and spending this time with us today and sharing the marvelous research you've done. Everyone, go out there and buy this book. Once again, it's Resisting Extortion, Victims, Criminals, and States in Latin America, out from Cambridge University Press. And on Amazon this morning, is now available in paperback, so you've no excuse not to get it. And join us next week also on our continuing Tuesday
for a great panel on the continuing political crisis in Peru.
Oh, I guess I won't be chairing that one.
No, I'm taking over for that one. But it's going to be a great discussion with some new and really smart voices on Peruvian politics.
Wonderful. So thank you all, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.